Good work, Blip. This stun ray should slow them down.
Space Ghost wasn't just another 60s cartoon, it was a strange experiment that crashed straight into Saturday mornings like a cosmic flare. A masked hero with no origin, a universe full of bizarre villains, and a production team making it all up at warp speed. The result? A show that felt dangerous, hypnotic, and completely unlike anything kids had ever seen. And what you're about to discover goes way deeper than nostalgia. Hidden production fights, weird studio decisions, characters that mutated across decades, and story arcs that were way ahead of their time. This is the part of Space Ghost nobody ever tells you about. These are 16 weird facts about Space Ghost 1966, the show that rewired Saturday mornings. Number 1. Alex Toth fought a secret war against Space Ghost's final design. When Hanna-Barbera brought in Alex Toth to design Space Ghost, the studio expected an easy assignment. What they got instead was a creative tug-of-war. Toth wanted a sleek, alien-looking defender of the cosmos, something strange, exotic, and otherworldly. But the network kept pushing him toward a traditional hero silhouette, with a cape, a mask, and a chest emblem big enough to see across a living room. To Toth, it felt like corporate hands trying to mold a space adventurer into a second-rate Batman. Behind the scenes, the arguments were intense. Toth complained that the cape made action scenes harder to animate, and the mask made the character feel too earthbound. He even sketched alternate designs with no cape at all to prove how much smoother the animation could be. But CBS executives refused. They believed familiar hero iconography would help kids instantly recognize him, a marketing move disguised as creative direction. Ironically, the design he pushed hardest against became the look that defined Space Ghost forever. Funny how that works.
We'll take care of you, Space Ghost!
You'll have to do better than that.
I can! One move and the girl dies!
Good work, Blip. I'll take over.
Number 2. Space Ghost has no real identity, and that was intentional. Unlike almost every superhero of the era, Space Ghost arrived on TV with no origin story, no real name, and absolutely zero background information. Kids in 1966 were used to heroes with tragic pasts, bitten by this, exposed to that, but Space Ghost just appeared out of the void, fully formed, already powerful, and already operating across the galaxy. Hanna-Barbera never explained who he was, where he came from, or why he even wore a mask in outer space. The reason? Time and money. Origin stories required extra backgrounds, extra characters, and extra animation, all things that stretched a limited 60s budget. Instead, the writers discovered something surprising. Leaving him mysterious actually made him more intriguing. Space Ghost became a blank canvas, a cosmic ghost you projected your own ideas onto. For kids, that made him feel larger than life, almost mythic. A superhero with no past somehow felt even bigger.
I know the outpost. I'm on my way. Keep out of danger. Let's go, Blip.
Number 3. His power bands were basically a Swiss Army weapon strapped to his wrists. If you grew up watching Space Ghost, those glowing wrist cuffs were the coolest gadgets on TV. But most kids never realized just how many abilities those power bands actually had. They weren't just laser guns, they could freeze enemies solid, create force fields, fire heat rays, emit stunning blasts, and even connect to his invisibility belt. It was like Hanna-Barbera gave him every sci-fi weapon imaginable and packed it into 2 tiny bracelets. The writers loved them because the band solved every story problem. Need to melt a robot? Power band. Need to cut through a meteor? Power band. Need to escape a villain's trap without drawing new animation? Power band. They were the ultimate cheat code in a decade when budgets were tight and deadlines were brutal. If something needed to happen fast, the bands did it. They were basically plot devices disguised as weapons. And it worked.
The heat ray doesn't stop them. I'll try the freeze ray.
Number 4, Space Ghost was forced to share his show with dinosaurs, literally. When CBS ordered Space Ghost in 1966, the network did something bizarre. They demanded he be paired with a completely unrelated cartoon called Dino Boy in the Lost Valley, a futuristic space hero fighting cosmic villains, matched with a kid surviving in a prehistoric jungle. 2 shows with nothing in common, jammed together because the network wanted to cover multiple demographics in one half-hour block. Behind the scenes, Hanna-Barbera wasn't thrilled. The studio had to split resources, series, stretch their small team across 2 different worlds, and maintain 2 totally separate animation pipelines. Creatively, it made no sense at all, and going from spaceships to dinosaurs in the same episode felt like switching channels without warning. But CBS insisted, believing the mashup would keep more kids glued to the TV. It was chaotic, strange, and completely unforgettable. A programming Frankenstein that somehow worked.
Dino Boy!
Number 5. The Council of Doom was one of the first major cartoon crossovers ever made. Late in the series, Hanna-Barbera pulled off something unheard of for 1966. They united Space Ghost's biggest villains into one interconnected story arc called the Council of Doom. Instead of random one-off enemies, kids suddenly got a multi-episode saga where Zorak, Brak, Moltar, the Creature King, and others teamed up to finally destroy the hero. For Saturday morning TV, which usually pressed the reset button every week, this was shockingly ambitious. The storyline forced the writers to stitch episodes together in ways the studio rarely attempted. Background art had to match across segments, villain roles needed continuity, and Space Ghost himself traveled through different worlds in a serialized chase. It was a massive headache for an animation team already working with limited time and recycled frames. But the gamble paid off. The arc felt bigger, more cinematic, and way more intense than anything kids were used to. A cosmic villain team-up, years before it was cool.
Space Ghost! At last, Council of Doom, we meet face to face. I'm going to put an end to your evil once and for all.
We must stop him, Brak. Open fire.
Number 6. Zorak went from terrifying villain to sarcastic talk show sidekick. In the original 1966 series, Zorak was meant to be one of Space Ghost's most menacing enemies, a giant insectoid mastermind with a voice that echoed like something crawling out of a cave. Kids genuinely found him creepy. He wasn't funny, he wasn't cute, and he definitely wasn't friendly. The writers built him as a cruel, calculating monster who wanted Space Ghost vaporized, not interviewed. But decades later, everything flipped. When Space Ghost Coast to Coast premiered in the 90s, the creators took that same nightmare villain and stuck him behind a keyboard as the hero's bitter, sarcastic band leader. It was one of the strangest reinventions in cartoon history. The once deadly villain became a comedy foil who roasted guests, rolled his eyes at Space Ghost, and acted like he'd rather quit the show than play another note. Somehow, the transformation worked so well that it introduced Zorak to an entirely new generation who never saw him as scary at all. 2 versions of the same character, one nightmare fuel, one deadpan comedian. What a pivot.
Space Ghost will be coming in on his famous Inviso power. He should be in range now. Turn on the matter intensifier.
Number 7. The show relied on extreme limited animation and hid it in plain sight. Space Ghost looked bold and dramatic on TV, but behind the scenes, Hanna-Barbera was working with some of the tightest budgets in the industry. To pull off a weekly space adventure, the studio leaned heavily on limited animation techniques, repeating mouth cycles, reusing flying poses, looping action shots, and even copying entire background plates across different planets. If you've ever felt like Space Ghost flew past the same asteroid cluster 3 times, you weren't imagining it. These shortcuts weren't laziness, they were survival. Each episode had to be delivered fast, and drawing new frames for every blast, punch, or teleport was simply impossible. So animators created a library of stock movements they could plug in whenever the script called for a dramatic moment. Add in a dramatic soundtrack or a zoom in, and most kids never noticed the recycling at all. In fact, the repetition became part of the show's visual identity. It was creativity under pressure, and they made it look effortless. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Space Ghost's strangest secrets, hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel grow and keeps these classic shows alive for future fans. And don't forget to hype the video so more people see it, and the algorithm knows you want more of these retro deep cuts. Because the next facts, they get even weirder, and some of them might change the way you remember this entire show. Number 8. Space Ghost exists because one CBS executive demanded space superheroes. In the mid-60s, CBS executive Fred Silverman was hunting for the next big Saturday morning hit. The space race was everywhere, on TV, in newspapers, in cereal box ads, and he wanted a cartoon that tapped straight into that national obsession. So he personally pushed Hanna-Barbera to create a brand new space-themed superhero who could compete with the wave of caped crusaders dominating comic books. Space Ghost wasn't born from a writer's imagination. He was born from a memo. Inside the studio, this mandate caused a scramble. Hanna-Barbera had never built a full action adventure show with cosmic battles, alien villains, and high-stakes chases. They were known for funny animals and slapstick. But Silverman insisted, and his pressure shaped everything. The tone, the stakes, even the look of the hero. It was network strategy first, creative vision second, And surprisingly, it worked. The show captured exactly the futuristic vibe kids were obsessed with, a hero created because the network smelled an opportunity. Number 9. Space Ghost pushed Hanna-Barbera into a new era of action cartoons. Before 1966, Hanna-Barbera was mostly known for lighthearted characters, talking animals, goofy sidekicks, and sitcom-style humor. Shows like The Flintstones, Huckleberry Hound, and Top Cat defined the studio's reputation. But when Space Ghost arrived, everything changed. For the first time, Hanna-Barbera had to build a serious, straight-faced action hero, battling cosmic threats instead of cracking jokes or chasing sandwiches. It was a massive creative pivot. This shift forced the studio to rethink its entire production style. They had to storyboard fights, choreograph spaceship battles, design alien worlds, and create villains who actually felt threatening. The studio even brought in more dramatic composers and background artists to make the show feel bigger than their usual comedic fare. In many ways, Space Ghost laid the groundwork for future action-heavy cartoons like the Herculoids, Birdman, and Thundar the Barbarian, a new path born from a single-masked hero. Number 10. Each episode flipped between two totally different worlds, and kids loved it. A typical Space Ghost episode didn't play out like a normal cartoon. Instead, CBS structured the show in a strange 3-part format. You'd start with a Space Ghost segment, suddenly jump to a Dino Boy in the Lost Valley adventure, and then snap right back into outer space for the final act. One minute you were watching laser blasts and alien criminals, the next you were in a jungle full of prehistoric beasts. It felt like switching channels without touching the TV. This format wasn't just unusual, it was risky. Juggling two unrelated storylines meant Hanna-Barbera had to split their already tight production schedule in half. Backgrounds, characters, and tone shifted so dramatically that animators joked they were making 2 shows for the price of 1. But that odd structure accidentally created a rhythm kids found addictive. The constant tonal whiplash kept young viewers from ever getting bored, even if it drove the animators crazy. A chaotic structure, but a memorable one. Number 11. Space Ghost had one of the wildest villain lineups of the entire 60s. For a show with only a single season, Space Ghost packed in an astonishing number of enemies. Instead of recycling 1 or 2 bad guys, Hanna-Barbera unleashed an entire gallery of cosmic weirdos: the insectoid Zorak, the molten armored Moltar, the robotic Metalis, the monstrous Creature King, the hypnotic Black Widow, Brak the Space Pirate, and dozens more. Each villain looked completely different from the last, giving the series a scope that felt almost comic book epic. What made this even stranger was the production reality. Villain designs were expensive, new models, new backgrounds, sometimes new animation cycles. But the studio kept pushing forward anyway. The belief was that a constantly shifting roster of threats would keep young viewers locked in, and they were right. Kids never knew what kind of creature, machine, or nightmare voice they were going to see next. The unpredictability became part of the show's charm, a rogues gallery way bigger than the budget allowed, and somehow they pulled it off. Number 12. The entire series only ran for 1 year, but fans swear it felt like a decade. Space Ghost left such a massive footprint that most people assume it ran for years. But in reality, the show's original run lasted from September 1966 to September 1967. Just one single season. 42 Space Ghost segments and 18 Dino Boy shorts, then it was over. No second season, no renewal, no long production schedule. It came and went like a cosmic flash. What makes this so weird is how deeply the show embedded itself into the memories of 60s kids. Reruns kept it alive, merchandise lingered in stores, and the bold character design stuck in people's heads long after the show stopped airing. For a brief moment, Space Ghost completely dominated Saturday mornings, and because it looked different from everything else on TV, it branded itself onto an entire generation's nostalgia with surprising force. A single season that somehow became timeless. Number 13. Its episode count was strangely uneven, and nobody expected it. Space Ghost's production numbers make almost no sense at first glance. The show delivered 42 Space Ghost segments, but only 18 Dino Boy segments, even though both series were packaged together every week. On paper, it looks like a scheduling mistake, but the imbalance was intentional. Space Ghost episodes were shorter, faster to produce, and easier to break into multiple parts, while Dino Boy required more detailed animation and more complex backgrounds. Behind the scenes, the numbers created logistical chaos. Editors had to juggle segments, reorder blocks, and stretch storylines to ensure the weekly broadcast didn't feel lopsided. Some weeks featured new Space Ghost adventures paired with repeated Dino Boy shorts, and some episodes had entirely different segment combinations depending on the region. For collectors, the mixed ratios turned early reruns into a puzzle that didn't always follow a logical pattern. A mismatched duo held together with scheduling tape. Number 14. Fans thought Space Ghost had supernatural powers, but it was all just tech. Because of his name, his glowing eyes, and the way he vanished into thin air, many kids in the 60s assumed Space Ghost was literally a ghost with supernatural abilities. They thought he could phase through matter, disappear at will, or drift through space like some kind of cosmic spirit. The truth was way less mystical. Every one of his ghost-like abilities came from gadgets, mainly his invisibility belt and those overpowered wristbands. This misunderstanding spread fast. Without an origin story or explanation, viewers filled in the blanks themselves. Parents wrote letters asking whether the show was about a dead astronaut, magazines speculated about hidden ghost lore, and some fan clubs even tried to map out a paranormal backstory for him. Hanna-Barbera never corrected any of it. They simply let the audience believe whatever made the show feel cooler. A ghost in name only, but the mystery made him unforgettable. Number 15. Space Ghost's legacy exploded decades later, and nobody saw it coming. When the show ended in 1967, Hanna-Barbera assumed Space Ghost would fade into the background, like most short-run cartoons of the era. But something strange happened. The bold designs, the eerie villains, and the mysterious hero stuck in people's memories. By the late 80s and early 90s, a new generation of animators who grew up watching Space Ghost were now adults working in television, and they resurrected the character in the weirdest way possible, as a deadpan late-night talk show host on Space Ghost Coast to Coast. The revival was surreal. Instead of fighting cosmic armies, Space Ghost interviewed celebrities with awkward pauses, bizarre jokes, and a volatile insect musician, Zorak, talking trash from the bandstand. What began as a low-budget experiment became a cult hit, introducing the hero to millions who had never seen the original series. Suddenly, Space Ghost wasn't just a relic. He was a multi-generation icon who jumped from 60s adventure to 90s absurdism without losing relevance. A hero reborn in the strangest way imaginable. Number 16. Space Ghost didn't get a proper home release until 2007, 4 decades later. For a show as iconic as Space Ghost, you'd expect a full home video release to arrive in the 80s or 90s, right when nostalgia was booming. But incredibly, fans had to wait 41 years before they could own the complete series. Hanna-Barbera didn't release Space Ghost and Dino Boy, the complete series, on Region 1 DVD until July 17, 2007, long after VHS culture had already come and gone. For decades, collectors were stuck with taped-off TV recordings and incomplete bootleg compilations. The delay wasn't because the show was forgotten, far from it. Rights issues, missing materials, and the sheer challenge of restoring limited-budget 60s animation all slowed down the process. When the DVD finally launched, it sold surprisingly well, proving just how deeply Space Ghost had imprinted itself on the generation that grew up with it. Fans who hadn't seen the original episodes since childhood suddenly had the entire cosmic universe back in their hands, a 4-decade wait for a hero who was always ahead of his time. Space Ghost wasn't just another 60s cartoon, it was a strange experimental collision of ideas that somehow turned into a classic. A masked hero with no origin, villains who looked ripped from nightmares, a production team inventing shortcuts on the fly, and a network pushing for something bigger than they could afford. And yet, out of all that chaos, they created a universe that stuck with kids for the rest of their lives. Decades later, the show is still talked about, still referenced, still revived, and still loved. Few one-season cartoons ever leave a footprint this big, and even fewer get rediscovered by entirely new generations. Space Ghost did both. And if you grew up with it, you already know why. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe and check out the playlist for more weird, forgotten, and fascinating stories from classic TV.